This man was an 18-year-old. He was told to go over the top out of the trench and across no man's land to raid the enemy trench. He was afraid and he jumped down into a shell hole and hid and was shivering down there. But Father Willie found him at the bottom of the shell hole, took out his rosary beads and said the rosary with that boy, gave him the last rites, gave him the rosary beads, and the boy got up and went and fought and survived the war.
I want to talk about a worldwide uprising of saints. Father Willie Doyle. Have you heard the story of Father Willie Doyle? We're going to have Patrick Kenny be on the program. And good morning to you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Joe. Good to talk to you.
So let's talk about Father Willie Doyle. Tell us, who was Father Willie Doyle?
Well, Father Willie Doyle was an Irish Jesuit priest, military chaplain, who was born in 1873 in Dublin in Ireland, and was killed in August 1917 in the Battle of Passchendaele. And he was killed while rushing out of the trenches in order to save wounded soldiers. It's something he did day after day after day, many, many times, putting his life on the line, knowing that he could be killed on any particular day, but always doing it with joy and serenity and courage. And interestingly, he offered up his life in reparation for the sins of priests. He was a victim soul in reparation for the sins of priests. So that's a summary of his life. But behind that, there was a lot of prayer, a lot of mortification, a lot of interesting apostolic activities in Ireland before he went to war.
Why did Willie Doyle feel called to the priesthood? At what point did he really give himself over to pursuing the Jesuits in particular?
To go back a little bit, I suppose, to the beginning of his story, he was born in 1873, effectively just a few weeks after St. Therese. And in many ways, his early life mirrors that of St. Therese. He, like St. Therese, he was the youngest of a large family, many of whom pursued a religious vocation. In Father Willie's instance, there was 4 out of the 7 children pursued a religious or priestly life. He grew up in a fairly pious household and decided at the age of 18 to become a Jesuit, mainly because his older brother had become a Jesuit. He wanted to be a diocesan priest, but the impact of his older brother, he gave him a book by St. Alphonsus Liguori on the religious life, and that's what encouraged him to actually become a Jesuit. But the real conversion of his life actually was about kind of exactly this time, 116 years ago, when he was doing the 30-day spiritual exercises for the second time. And that was a real immersion in he was a priest at the time. He'd lived a good life as a seminarian and in his first year of priesthood. But it was really that experience of the spiritual exercises that really converted him. But just to give you a little bit of his spirit when he was ordained on the 28th of July, 1907. Providentially or coincidentally, in the same ceremony as Blessed John Sullivan, another well-known Irish Jesuit priest who was beatified 6 years ago. And in his diary on the morning of his ordination, he said that his earnest wish and firm resolve was to strive with might and main to become a saint. So that was his aspiration at that moment of ordination. And if we take that date, the 28th of July, it's actually really, really interesting when we look at what happened to him spiritually on that date in other years, and it gives you a real clue to the spirit of the man. Because if we fast forward 7 years later, the 28th of July 1914, Father Willie writes in his diary that he was praying in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, and he felt the Lord say to him in adoration, "Do the hard thing for my sake."
Wow.
And at least in Europe, we all know when the First World War ended. That was the 11th of November 1918, but we don't generally pay much attention to the date the First World War started. And it was that very day, the 28th of July 1914, Father Willie felt that call within his heart to do the hard thing for God's sake. 4 months later, he volunteered as a chaplain. And if you take that same date, 28th of July, fast forward 3 years, 1917, the very last thing he wrote in his diary was that he offered his life up in reparation for the sins of priests. And 3 weeks later, he was dead.
That strong history and tradition of so many heroic Jesuits that went to their death, proclaiming the good, the true, and the beautiful, even to people who would murder them and torture them. Father Willie seems to be in that same vein.
Absolutely. And I mean, we spoke about his early piety and his early life. One of the things that the family read very consistently within the household was Butler's Lives of the Saints. Ooh. And that was something that nourished the piety of that family. So he would have known all about the Jesuit martyrs and early martyrs. He had a great devotion to the early Roman martyrs as well. So he was very much inspired by their story. And that's something that we have to remember for our own families, the importance of the lives of the saints, the heroism of their example. And that's something that inspired Father Willie. And in fact, if you look at the website there again, you could see a picture of that oblation of his life, and you could see that he signed it in his blood. And he has 2 bloody thumbprints there where he really offered that life. And he never forgot that offering. In June 1917, just 2 months before he was killed, he refers back to that offering of his life. It's something that he remembered. It wasn't something that was done casually.
Was he close to the Blessed Mother? Did he have a strong devotion to her? St. Alphonsus de Liguori, has to have been, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he refers somewhere in his diaries to the consecration he made to Mary. We obviously know he said the rosary every day. We have his rosary beads as well, which we bring to talks that we give. There's an interesting story I received one time from a man whose grandfather knew Father Willie in the First World War, and this man was an 18-year-old. He was told to go over the top out of the trench and across no man's land to raid the enemy trench. And he was 18 and he was afraid, and he jumped down into a shell hole and hid and was shivering down there. And of course, the penalty if you're found derelict in your duty is that, well, if you're not shot by the enemy, you'll be shot by your own men. He could have been executed. Wow. But Father Willie found him at the bottom of the shell hole. He lay down in the shell hole with him, took out his rosary beads and said the rosary with that 18-year-old terrified boy in the shell hole with bombs and bullets flying all around, gave him the last rites, gave him the rosary beads, and the boy got up and went and fought, survived the war, and kept those rosary beads for his entire life, and was actually buried with them in the 1970s when he died. So wow. Father Willie had a great devotion to Mary. On feast days, he often felt he received favors and graces from Mary as well. So that's something that certainly comes across in his spiritual life.
Father Willie seems to be fearless in this. And some of the stories that I've heard are he didn't have any fear whatsoever. He just it was his duty to go out and he would remain cheerful in spite of all of the insane chaos and stress and anxiety of combat. Tell me some more of the stories that men would say about him and in the midst of all of that.
Well, one of the newspapers after he was killed referred to him as walking with death with a smile on his face. And that's how the soldiers who knew him described him. But what's interesting, if we look back to his early life, just after he wrote that oblation of his life to Mary, his novitiate building went on fire, and he was caught up in the fire, had to be evacuated from it, and we're told that he had a complete nervous breakdown as a result of being caught up in the fire. And he had to leave the Jesuits for a short period of time to recuperate. And it was unusual that he would have been let back into the Jesuits because there were so many vocations at the time. He might have been thought to be unsuitable for it, but they obviously saw something about the man that they wanted to bring him back. And the remarkable part of his story is the complete transformation, because never again did he seem to suffer from anxiety or fear. There was some sort of healing or transformation in his life. So much so that men flocked to him in the war. He was an oasis of peace, we would say. He was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery in the Battle of the Somme. There's a remarkable scene, which he writes about in his letters, where they're on their way to the Battle of the Somme and they're marching over the body of dead men, marching over the body of fallen men who'd lain there sometimes for hours or days or weeks. He describes walking on bodies and your foot going down through the body because the body is decayed. And yet, he knows he's potentially going to his death, but he remains serene and calm in the midst of all of that. A remarkable story of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in his life, a testament to the prayer and mortifications that he did that equipped him and trained him. But there are many, many stories of his heroism, nearly killed on multiple occasions, hit by shrapnel, risking his life going out at night, risking himself to bury the dead as well. That was a dangerous activity, and he was very much involved in burying the dead, that corporal work of mercy. So many, many stories like that.
So I want to go back to the point where he offers his life for the sins of priests. I find that incredible. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking to a friend about St. Padre Pio. The reason why he received the stigmata was for the sins of bishops and priests. Tell me about Father Willie Doyle and making this very, very similar, seems like almost the same thing, making this same sort of offering.
Yeah, well, before I go into that, there's a remarkable similarity there between Father Willie and Padre Pio. And when I looked up a date there a few weeks ago, I got a shiver down my spine, because Father Willie was appointed to the British Army on the 15th of November 1915. Padre Pio was drafted to the Italian Army on the 15th of November 1915, exactly the same day. These two priests who were victim souls in reparation for the sins of priests, each appointed to an army in the First World War, one as a chaplain, one as a soldier. But obviously a remarkable coincidence or act of providence there in terms of dates. The spirituality of reparation, the spirituality of being a victim soul was something that was much more prevalent or common in the church's life 100 years ago. We don't hear so much about it now, but I mean, it is needed now. I mean, it's not any less relevant now than it was back then, obviously. And it's something that Father Willie lived for many, many years. He was very dedicated to priests, very dedicated to vocations. He wrote 2 best-selling pamphlets on vocations and a religious life, one called Shall I Be a Priest? And the other one called Vocations. They sold in the tens of thousands of copies during his lifetime. I once received a letter from a retired English priest who had been a soldier in the Second World War, and his chaplain gave him one of Father Willie's pamphlets on the priesthood, and he read it and decided to become a priest. And he met the chaplain a few years later, and he said, "I want to thank you for giving me that pamphlet from Father Doyle. It's the reason I became a priest." And the chaplain said, "Well, that's amazing, because I know at least 11 other soldiers who became priests from reading that pamphlet." And even today I receive reports of young men and women who are pursuing religious life because of Father Willie's example and his writings. So the holiness of priests was something very close to his heart, and also that offering of reparation of himself. So he lived a life, even though he himself was a very cheerful, happy man who was renowned for practical jokes. After he died, his private diaries revealed what was going on inside of him, because the First World War was only one of the wars that he fought. The more important war that he fought was the internal spiritual war to overcome himself and to grow in holiness. And a big part of that spiritual battle that he fought was one of reparation for the sins of priests. So we know that in wintertime, in one of the houses that he lived in Ireland, there was a pond in the garden, and he would get up at 3 a.m. in winter and go out and immerse himself up to his neck in reparation for the sins of others, particularly the sins of priests. So it was something that was pretty constant throughout his life. It's not that he was aware of any particular crimes that priests had committed, but it was more so in terms of laziness and not saying Mass well, not saying the office well. They're the kind of references that we see to the sins of priests in his diary. And he himself lived a life of incredible zeal. Before he went to the war, he was a well-known missionary priest in Ireland, sometimes spending 14, 15 hours a day in the confessional, modelling himself on the Curie of Ars. We know that he had a 10-day leave from the war at one point, about 6 weeks after he was gassed in a gas attack and was nearly killed. And he came home, and on that 10 days of leave, he gave a retreat to a convent of nuns in another part of the country. So even on his leave, he was zealous and out there trying to bring people closer to God. So we had a very high ideal of the priesthood and of the holiness that priests and that everyone had to have. He wasn't a clericalist. He also organized retreats for working men. So he believed in the universal call to holiness, but particularly the holiness of priests. And he said that a holy priest strikes fear into the devil, that, a holy priest does so much more than a lukewarm priest ever could.
And I understand he practiced grave penances too, the flagellation and all of that, hair shirts, I imagine.
Yeah, he wasn't unusual in that, in terms of the lives of the saints, but even in terms of the lives of priests at the time.
Yeah.
So he himself certainly practiced a life of great austerity, of heroic penance in many respects. But the important thing is that he had permission for all of that from his superiors and his confessors, explicitly so. He had permission. It never damaged his health. And really, it's what trained him for the war. It's what equipped him for his later ministry. So he had a lot of ill health in his earlier life. He had a stomach complaint, a digestive problem, that nervous breakdown. But yet we don't see that impacting upon him in the war. He was trained by that asceticism. But what's interesting is his advice to others was not to take on the heavy penances that he himself lived. And he told them, like St. Therese, to do little things and to do them with love.
Yeah.
And he said, the smaller you make it, but the more often you do it, the better.
His witness was to not just Catholics, but to non-Catholics. Everyone seemed to be attracted to him.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is he died while saving wounded Protestant soldiers. There were soldiers from Northern Ireland, Protestant soldiers, and he went out and laid down his life to save them. And as you mentioned earlier, in terms of Irish history, that's very significant. A big conflict here Catholic, Protestant. He died saving wounded Protestant soldiers. And one of my favorite stories about Father Willie was an occasion in which he was with the doctor. They were in a dugout. They had no blankets. They had no trench sheet. It was winter. It was cold. The ground was damp. And the doctor was sick with a fever. Father Willie lay face down on the ground and told the doctor to lie on his back for the night so the doctor who was sick would have somewhere warm and dry to sleep. That doctor was also a Protestant doctor. So Father Willie's love for others was universal. He helped capture German prisoners as well, gave spiritual advice and ministrations to them. So he believed in a universal call to love.
Where's the status of his cause? There is a cause for his canonization. Where is he on that process?
Okay, so his cause was opened last year, and the actor for the cause is the Father Willie Doyle Association, which is a lay association. We do it with the assistance and support of the Irish Jesuit province, but it's the association itself, which is the actor, and it's the first time a lay association has been founded in this country in order to do that, in order to take on that work. So he's a servant of God. His cause was opened in the Diocese of Meath, which is where he did his novitiate and where he wrote that oblation or offering of his life that you showed earlier. We're going through the early stages of the process. Please pray for the cause. Go onto the website, williedoyle.org. It's updated pretty much every day. You can request prayer cards, relics, and get further information there. And if anyone wants to help us out spiritually, but also materially, we need temporal help as well. So any help anyone could give, or if you know a parish conference or anything that wants us to come and talk, we'll be happy to do that.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.